This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 78, Summer PD Series number 5. When you start to fuel and start to put all of these pieces together and you build momentum from September through May, and you build momentum from year 2 to year 5, as all of this snowballs, you you truly can get to a point where you can just focus on meeting with kids. And that is where great instruction happens, and that's where you can identify what they truly need, and you can really push them to new levels, and you can push them to accomplish great things with you and without you. And
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Kennerman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I am here with my co-host, Mr. Matt, the store manager Rogers. Matt, how we doing tonight?
I cannot wait to understand why that is my nickname for this episode.
Well, this is Summer PD Series continued, and we're jumping into Teach Like a CEO Part 2. I think I gave you the title of COO last time, so you've been downgraded, unfortunately, to store manager, but it's still a very prestigious, respectful position when you hold that. You're in the grind every day. You're in the trenches when you're a store manager, holding all the pieces together.
Sounds fairly accurate.
Yeah, exactly. So if this is the first time you are listening to us, this is going to be slightly different than the typical show format that we've run with for almost all 70 episodes. If you've been tuning in throughout our summer PD series, then you've heard this before, and I apologize. But just to clarify, we typically have an amazing educator on with us every week. Teachers still in the classroom. They've just transitioned into being leaders, and we've even had some very high-level keynotes and great authors on our show as well. But our bread and butter is jumping into their stories, their passions, what makes them special, and what makes their classrooms and their schools special places, and pulling those out and learning from them and connecting them to ourselves and to other educators. For this summer, we have been rolling with specific topics. We've had some former guests come back with us to try to just develop a little bit more of a professional development focus to gear you up and get you ready for the school year upcoming. And so for clarification and just for some context, I am a former fifth grade teacher. I am a former elementary STEM teacher, and now I serve as a secondary instructional coach in my district. And so, Matt, why don't you say hi to everybody again and just quick clarification on your position as it fits this conversation.
All right. My name is Matt Rogers, and I'm a fourth grade facilitator out of Pequay Valley School District in Lancaster, PA, and apparently part-time store manager. So and so I've been teaching fourth grade now for 8 years, and I taught 5 years of fourth and fifth grade learning support before transitioning to regular ed.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we are jumping into Teach Like a CEO Part 2. And this is a framework that I've really been developing and flushing out this year just through my own writing, my own reframing of things that I did in my classroom, as well as some professional development that I've done with some school districts, as well as presentations in the past and upcoming. And the idea of Teach Like a CEO is it is a play on words with the role a CEO plays in a major corporation. But the 3 letters stand for developing a culture for learning, creating empowering learning experiences, which we're going to jump into with this episode, and operations for classroom management. And the idea is taking that CEO mindset and thinking about how it is their responsibility to manage large corporations. They can't be involved in the nitty gritty, the daily operations, but they are involved in very high level and very important conversations with employees from the bottom to the top. And so taking that idea and thinking about how can we implement systems into our own classroom that develops the culture for learning, these empowering experiences, and leveraging operations where the teacher can step to the side and allow the systems to take over, the systems that we implement. And the ultimate goal, and this is something that I don't ever want to forget to convey with this message, Matt, is the whole point of this is so that I can pull that small group for instruction. I can pull that one student who needs remediation or that one student who needs enrichment. It gives me the freedom to truly individualize and personalize my instruction. And that's the ultimate goal of teaching like a CEO. It's not to step to the side and just watch everything happen. That's part of it. But it's really so that you can do everything possible to support every student in every way that they need. So you already heard part one, Matt, on the culture of learning. So any reflections that you have from that and just the CEO framework and mindset overall before we jump into these empowering experiences?
So I think the one thing I'll highlight you just kind of talked about is how teach like a CEO translates into your role as an educator in the classroom. I think that's a really nice clarification that you are creating time. And I know, Ken, we've had conversations about things like flipped learning and, uh, project based learning. And when we turn responsibility to the kids, what is our role? Because it is definitely not sit on your chair or take a nap in the corner of the room. It's utilizing that time as productively as possible to, target instruction. We as educators know that essentially running a regular ed or special ed or gifted or whatever type classroom is essentially juggling a ton of different responsibilities, so that if you can efficiently cover some of those responsibilities while also creating time for yourself to really target the needs of the classroom, that's why Teach Like a CEO is valuable. And I think what's different between Teach Like a CEO, which, I've had the pleasure of hashing out with you mostly after recordings weekly, really comes down to it's a guideline, not necessarily a pathway. And the clarification I'd make there is here are ways to consider the importance of creating culture, creating empowering experiences for kids, managing the classroom in a way that's efficient, that all that structure that you create allows you to really bring your own spice into the teaching kitchen. And I think that's what separates it, at least for me, from other um, educational theories or ways to manage, whether it's responsive classroom or mass customized learning. These are different structures that again allow the teacher to have flexibility of how they target the most beneficial learners of their time, as opposed to stand and deliver in the front of the class.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcasts. Now let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that clarification, and so thank you for sharing that. And we will talk a little bit tonight in this empowering experiences portion about things you can do when you're working with your students. But I think out of everything that happens with student centered learning, if you talk to experienced teachers, even newer teachers, the easiest part is when you have four kids sitting in front of you and you're doing a mini lesson, because that's just getting down to just good old school teaching, whether it's technology or not. What I mean by that is, hey, I have four kids in front of me that need help with identifying main idea. I have four kids in front of me that need to learn, the structure of a cell or need to learn how to add fractions. When you tell that to a teacher and they're experienced in that content, you could put any four kids in front of them that they've never met before, and they're going to effectively teach them pretty well or extremely well. But it's everything else that's happening around that. It's everything else that leads up to that moment of being able to identify those kids, where these frameworks that we're going to talk about tonight, developing these empowering experiences, is key. So before I jump in, something you want to say?
Yeah, I just want to share, Ken, I'd like to counter your statement. I don't know about you. Like, there's a fear that I have when it comes to sitting at a small group table, because we are so used to a scripted curriculum. But just because, your curriculum doesn't create time, that's where the beauty and the art of teaching comes in. That is so important in our career, that it shouldn't feel like an obsolete skill or an uncomfortable skill. It should be. We all recognize that that is the most valuable learning opportunities. Just how many times do you get to create that? For me, it hasn't been as many as I would like, and that's why it's slightly uncomfortable to say, oh, here's a skill and here's what I need to drill down and target. I don't do that a ton right now, but I know that's what I should do if I want to do the best thing for kids.
That's a good point, and what we will jump into some of the things that we talk about tonight, how it can actually just help you prepare your mindset for those mini lessons, and how even that mindset preparation will have a massive impact on your comfort and your success with those 2, 3, 4, 8 students that you have sitting in front of you. So I want to start with a story of my own kids. Actually, when we're talking about what does it mean to empower them, what does this empowering experiences mean? And the thing that I think is really important to think about is you need to invest in your students to, one, feel have them feel as though you believe in them, you're confident in them, that's empowering them, but also that they feel empowered themselves. They feel confident and motivated themselves. So, a couple months ago, I was making lunches for the next day, and my kids wanted to help. And so we have this little ladder that they can step up and safely be close to the counter. And we were making tuna salad. And so we like to put hard boiled eggs in our tuna salad. And so we have these plastic knives that can legitimately cut, but they're safe for the kids to use. And I showed them how to use it. And so before even doing that, I showed them how to peel the hard boiled eggs. And I could have peeled 2 hard boiled eggs in about 30 seconds, but they wanted to do it. I showed them how to do it, and it took them about 10 minutes to each peel their own egg. And they did it well. They asked for help when they needed it. Towards the end, when the egg was starting to slip out, I may have grabbed it from my younger one, but they peeled the egg themselves. And then we slid over to the other portion of the counter, and I showed them how they should cut the egg. Cut it in half, lay the flat side down, put it in slices, turn it. So they cut it. The eggs weren't cut the exact way I would have. They weren't perfectly even pieces. Maybe they were a little bit bigger chunks than I would have done, but they did it themselves. And so making tuna salad probably took us about 45 minutes. But the next time I go to do it, maybe it'll only take us 44 minutes or 40 minutes. My kids at the time were 3 and 2. And so what I'm doing is I'm investing in them to, one, have a appreciation for making their own lunches, but also the confidence to cut an egg, cut a hard boiled egg, or maybe cut a vegetable next time. And so over time, it will take them less time to do it. And over time, I won't have to stand there anymore. I won't have to supervise them. I won't have to remind them of the steps. They'll be able to do it on their own. And as a teacher, we can do the same thing in our classroom. We can invest time, especially in the beginning of the year, to empower our students to, one, be able to learn independently, to be able to adjust to systems and instructional strategies that we do in our classroom, but we have to invest in that learning process. And so sometimes we're investing in teaching them how to learn. We're teaching them how to dive into content that we're going to work with, so that over time I can step back and trust that they're doing it on their own.
And by the time they're 5 and 7, they'll be running
They'll
a
make my lunch.
full-fledged restaurant and paying your salary. I think it's impressive, and Ken actually sent me a picture, a video of them working in the kitchen and saying, "This is gonna make this in my series at some point, I think." And his son KJ, there he is on the step stool, helping his daughter Lindsay with that. And the key thing that we hear about is authentic learning experiences and intrinsic motivation. Those are the two big keys to learning. The idea of them actually wanting to take part in the experience, not having to, want to, and it's authentic. We can generalize that skill to something else. And I think we as educators know that those two keys really are pillars of high quality instruction. Now, I cannot wait how you translate this, and I know you have, so that's what I'm looking forward to, from a group of two. You know, your newborn is obviously not helping yet, I don't believe, but how you translate that from a group of two where you're within arm's reach of them the entire time to what that looks like in a classroom. Not all of us teach classrooms of 12 to 15 kids.
Hmm. Yeah. And, what I'll say is a lot of the things I'm going to share tonight are not these groundbreaking, innovative strategies like having my kids help in the kitchen. I'm not the first parent to ever do that on the face of the earth. But the purpose of that story and that analogy is the consistent commitment to allowing my children to do that. And that's the key ingredient with this in our classrooms as well. So a simple example, screencasts. Screencast flipped learning was a huge part of the success in my classroom. And the main reason is whether it's my screencast, which a lot of them were, but I did also leverage things like Khan Academy, where they taught skills very well that I wanted to teach in my classroom, or other teachers that had lessons on YouTube and different resources. I tried to make as many as I could of myself. But it was a huge part of my classroom. And the reality is it's not so that I have to teach my kids less, it's so that I can teach them more. I can have 8 set of students learning one skill and a separate 8 students learning another skill while I'm working with another 8 students on one of those skills, or maybe even a third in person. And so screencast became, and just flipped lessons in general, sometimes I was in front of the camera, became a huge part of my classroom. And so I needed to invest my time into empowering my students to, one, feel successful and comfortable with that type of learning, and two, for me to feel confident that they could legitimately learn that way. And so very early in the year, I told my students about how I made videos, and I showed them some examples and how this was going to be a big part of our classroom. And if they wanted to succeed and they wanted to be able to do well in class, they had to learn how to learn from this format. And so the first time they ever watched a lesson to learn a skill, every single one of my students was watching it at the same time. And so this was even a big task for me because I was never one to one. I never taught in a one to one environment. My district was behind at the, not behind at the elementary level, but just wasn't one to one in elementary by the time I left. And so, it was renting laptop carts and that type of thing. And so we just established some common rules. You have headphones in. You have to have headphones. If you don't, if you don't have them, go borrow them. You always have to have a piece of paper and a pencil in front of you. It could be a worksheet that I provide that correlates to it. If it's there, if it's not, it's any type of scrap paper that you can get. And so those two simple rules were always in place. And so we spent the first time watching one together as a whole class, having them watch it themselves and doing the skill. And then I would meet with them in small group to see, did they understand what they were learning? And so investing that time in the beginning of the year, a couple times where screencasts were designed to be leveraged in small group. However, I wanted everyone to do it at the same time to learn how to utilize that. And then anytime I was doing small group instruction and screencasts were used, I could call out and say, hey, Lindsay, get a piece of paper. They would forget, but it was a simple reminder and they knew the expectations of what they were supposed to do. So if they forgot, it was a simple fix. And so I would front load that in the beginning of the year so that I was able to leverage screencasts, which I will reference later when I talk about the whole structure of a classroom and how that really made a huge impact on the classroom as a whole. Another example, if you don't have anything to interject with, I'll just give another different strategy. I did a lot with partners. I did a lot with collaboration, whether it was peer editing or it was learning something and teaching each other. So a thing I like to do a lot was I would give them, if we were doing something in math, maybe 2 slightly more challenging problems, half the class would get one, half the class would get the other. So they'd be A and B. Or if we were doing a couple different terms in social studies, half the class would get one set, half the class would get the other set. And so what I did was I split my board down the middle. I wrote A on one side, B on the other. When you were an A person and you were finished solving your problem, you had practiced solving it, you were confident enough that you could teach someone else, or you knew all your terms, you were confident enough that you could teach someone your terms. As an A person, I would go up and write my name on the A side. I would go back to my seat and I would work on something else that we had. We always had a checklist of independent work to work on. If another A person finishes, they go up to the board, they write their name on it. Once a B person finishes, if there's names on the A side, they don't write their name. They erase an A name and they go to that person, and now they sit down and they teach each other the terms, or they teach each other the problems, and they interact with each other. And the process continues. And so it's a system in place that always allows for immediate assigning of partners with an intended purpose. I could use the same system for peer editing when they were ready to work with someone to analyze their introduction or check for spelling. Anytime I wanted them to work together, it was a simple A/B partner system. They all understood it. We practiced. We set up a whole lesson where I wanted them to work together. I met with no one. I just monitored the group to make sure every student understood the system. So if there was names on the B side, someone didn't walk up and write their name on the A side. They had to understand that, oh, I have to erase someone's name. So I invested that time. So that any time I wanted to implement something where they could work in partners, whether it be to review, to teach each other, anything that I wanted them to do, I had a system in place so that I could then focus my time with my small group instruction that I was doing.
All right, so I'm still in that second one for sure. But I guess a few of the thoughts that pop in my head based off those two examples is, it seems like those are two totally different times that you would use those strategies. And I would almost implore to see other variations of the same strategy. But I want to just point out, correct me if I'm wrong, you're using screencasting as the primary introduction or instruction of material, whereas you're using your partner, A and B, to leverage group creating and, the teaching of another to really, the classic, if you really know something, you're able to teach someone how to do it. Are there other examples of each of those that you could leverage? Because say I don't have access to videos, or maybe I'm not comfortable putting myself in the video, or, the idea of recording all these videos is very overwhelming to me. What are other ways that you would consider in that teach like a CEO as both instruction provided as well as group interactions?
So that's a good question. I would say for other ways to independently instruct your students, I think it really depends on your content. So if you're not comfortable with doing screencasts, I would encourage you to, set a goal to even just do one and find that comfort level. And one thing that I find with teachers is they don't like the sound of their voice. And I like to remind them that the voice they hear on the recording is the voice that their students hear every single day. So it's not anything different. But, if you're not comfortable with that, there are resources out there. Like I said, Ed Puzzle is another way to leverage other videos that are out there. You can easily trim and cut YouTube videos, Khan Academy videos, and you can embed questions into the learning process. There's nothing wrong with training your students how to read articles. If that's as a secondary social studies or a secondary, English teacher or science teacher, that's a skill that your students should be able to do. But you need to invest time in setting expectations for what does reading an article for purpose look like. Do you want to implement close reading strategies where they're annotating in the margins or they're highlighting a minimum amount of text? Should they always have, like I said, a highlighter and a pencil next to them? So setting those expectations for what independent learning looks like in your classroom, I think is really important. At a primary level, there's nowadays, especially with technology, there's so many resources out there like, Study Island, First in Math, Freckle, IXL. There's so many of these resources that are legitimate ways for students to practice skills or even to be introduced to skills and learn through trial and error for them to independently learn skills in your classroom. And, we'll kind of get into this when I talk about the whole structure of a classroom and what this can look like and how these different strategies are put into play. But, I would say evaluate your students and your comfort level. Do you feel as though they have to learn the content from you first? If that's the case, then the activities the students are going to engage in might be more review based. For me, I found that students could learn in multiple ways. They still did learn new skills from me, but they also learned new skills from those screencasts, or from reading articles, or from creating things on their own. So, they can learn through the creation process. That AB partner system that I was referencing, those are new terms they're exploring in social studies. They're not review terms. They can look it up in the textbook, or they can look it up in an online database, a resource that you have, and they can try to develop their own understanding. Um, and so those are just different ways that I would say to open your eyes up to instruction. New instruction doesn't have to come from my mouth, if that makes sense.
The only thing I just question or maybe reiterate is using the traditional teach like a CEO. Realistically, the CEO should be the hardest worker in the company. And I just want to clarify, your view is realistically, you are spending and creating a ton of time ahead of time in preparation. This is not a, fly by the seat of your pants style, because you need to have layers of options, of almost choose your own endings for kids that accelerate, how you're remediating, how you're, creating those opportunities. That is something that comes from a really well prepared classroom. And I want you to kind of speak to that before we really get into the topic tonight, because I hear, just the idea of, oh, I could create a screencast for every instruction. Oh my goodness, that's so much time. Well, if I think about it that way, it's probably quicker for me to share what I want to share than to vet 2 or 3 videos on a topic, because we have to, technically we are responsible for all of the content of the video or the audio. So you're listening to it all anyway, or should be, is a really good way to put it, before you're putting it out there. So just kind of talk to your work process and kind of your views on that as well.
Yes, and that's a good transition into kind of what I wanted to jump into next. And yes, it is an investment in time. It's an investment in your own time. And these different ideas and strategies, this was years of progression for me. And so we kind of talked about that progression in part one. And developing screencasts, maybe you develop one for every unit next year, and you do that 3 years in a row, and over time you have more available, or you vet more of these resources, or you find those articles. And I think what's important about that first part of the independent learning tasks is, in order for us, which is the ultimate goal, to work with students individually or in a small group, you have to have students working independently. That's just simple math. And the key is, whatever those different styles of independent learning that are going to work for you, for your students and your content, the most important thing is that you empower the students to legitimately be able to learn that way. And you do that through committing time to teaching them how to learn through those different styles. So, a big piece of that preparation and knowing what to do with students is data. And data is a term that makes a lot of teachers, shiver, and we don't like that sound. But you know, data was a huge part of my classroom, and it has to be a huge part of your classroom in order for you to truly know what type of instruction students need and what they need from you. And the most important thing about data is that it's automated, it's systematic, and it's purposeful. I didn't spend time tabulating data. I spent time creating a system, which usually was a Google form. Socrative was another big one that I used. GoFormative is a phenomenal tool. I didn't use it, but we use it now in my district. Quizzes, Kahoot, all of these different things are ways to um, systematically and automatically grade things for you, so that you know where your students are at. And that's the key. That's the key part. You know where your students are at. But another piece of that, and this is where the empowerment comes in again, is that you involve the students in the data process. So if I was giving a pretest on a unit, the students would not see the results because there was a good chance that most of them would bomb it. And that's kind of the purpose of learning. I would have a few students that would excel highly, and I knew what I could let them skip, what I could immediately enrich them on. I knew students were kind of where they should be, and they could just get the, for lack of a better term, traditional instruction that was expected for students in that grade level. And then students were below that were going to need a lot more than that. But when it was a mid unit check, when it was a lesson check, when it was a skill check that it was something that they learned and they should be able to do, they always saw the results. I wanted them to be aware of how they were doing. I always told them when it comes to test time, nobody should be surprised. I know how you're going to do, and you should know how you're going to do because we've checked in throughout the process to know how you're doing with this. And so, when using Google Forms as an example, you turn on these C responses. And, maybe I would hide the correct answers so that they knew they were wrong, but I wanted my students to be aware. And in the beginning, it was weird for them and it was awkward for them and they didn't really know what to do. But as the year went on and we talked about, what should they do when they see that they did really well? They should, say, okay, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm paying attention. I'm using the strategies that I'm learning in class. I'm successfully independently learning, as well as, using my time with Mr. Ehrman. If they didn't do well, that should be a red flag for you. That should be I need to, ask for help. Or it was also, okay, I didn't do well, but I know tomorrow I'm probably going to meet with Mr. Ehrman because he meets with the kids that need help first. He makes sure that he spends time with those kids. I spend time with every kid, even for enrichment, but they knew that mindset going in like, okay, tomorrow I'm going to review this with him because I didn't do well. I even had students that would ask me, hey, Mr. Ehrman, like I didn't do well on the check. Can I try again? I don't think I was paying attention. That's a question that we would love to hear all the time from our students. Yes, please, you
Totally.
can try again. Please, you can work harder. So, involving them in that, you're empowering them to be aware of how successful they're doing and how successful they are with the skills in your classroom. And that creates, that fuels that culture of learning that we talked about in that first part. These kind of all mesh together. But I'm building the empowerment deliberately and explicitly into the instruction while also collecting all that data to make my plan for the next day.
I think you bring up data and yeah, I mean, it sends shivers down my neck. And realistically, it sends shivers down my neck because I'm not prepared. And I hate to, have that as an admission up front, but oh my goodness, I gave an assessment and I have the assessment graded, analyzed, and that enrichment or adjustment created by the next school day. You've got to be kidding me, Ken. Like there's a discipline by all means. And it's a little different in elementary school because it's so much less about the grades. Not to say that they're not important, but middle school and high school grades really matter. And a teacher giving feedback on a piece at that secondary level, they have to have those windows and those guidelines of, it will be graded within this window of time because it matters to these students in a little bit different way, whether it's that self-advocation, the opportunity to retake, or just learn so that when you have a future assessment, you're able to, be a little more successful. Analyze, did I study well? Could I have done better? I guess what I'm struggling with, Ken, is, it sounds dandy, and it honestly sounds like our professional responsibility. But do you feel like you were able to accomplish all those features within data, even if it was relatively automated? Because I'll tell you, there are some times that I have things automated and I look at it, I'm like, oh, great, they scored this percentage, and I don't drill any further down. I don't check to say, oh, you know what, their vocabulary score tanked, but they made up for it in a different area. I just say, oh, they got a 83, they must have gotten the majority of the information. So talk to me about, what is that data, evaluation, and where are you going next once you have this data to really drive instruction, target learners where they're actually at? I should clarify before you start. I look at data plenty. I promise I'm dramatizing that, but go ahead.
No, I think it's a good point, and it does sound overwhelming, and all I can say is that I was a very hardworking teacher, but I can also promise you that I was not there for 2 hours before school and 3 hours after school. I was very committed to working hard and putting in, the extra time, but I wasn't doing anything that was just absolutely ridiculous in terms of a time commitment. And you bring up a good point. What do you look at when you look at the data? So, a lot of the things I was creating myself, and it was very simple. Like, even, and keep in mind, again, I was not one to one. I had 10 laptops for 30 students. And so, if they were solving problems in math, and I typically don't ever do multiple choice in math, but depending on the skill, open-ended responses would not automatically grade well. So I would have them work on something on paper, and then when they got to the Google form, I needed it to do two things: be really fast for them to fill out because they needed to get off of that laptop so somebody else could use it, and I needed to automatically grade. So I did do multiple choice, and I explained to them, and it took time, but they got used to the system quick. If you don't see your answer, you click the last choice, that's I don't know. And so they were committing themselves to saying, I didn't get this right. I'm not going to guess, because I told them, if you guess and you guess right, I'm not going to help you because you're telling me that you understand this skill. And then at some point, you're going to fall off the bandwagon because you weren't getting the support that you needed. I have you categorized in a totally different group. And so, again, looking, what do you want to gain from that? So, if it's a general skill, are they high or are they low or are they in the middle? That was sometimes I would just look at the percentage and group them for the next day or for 2 days after that, depending on when we would circle back. There were other times where we're looking at a skill and it's wildly different mini skills in there. So if it's improper fractions and mixed numbers that I taught, some kids didn't know how to do anything with them. Some kids could change improper fractions to mixed numbers, but they couldn't change mixed numbers to improper fractions. So when I was looking at the data, I was looking at who got question 1 and 2 wrong. That was, the one way. That's a group. Who got questions 3 and 4 wrong? That's another group. There might be kids that end up in both groups. There might be kids that end up in none of the groups or one of the groups. I didn't look, I wasn't worried about that. I just said, who do I need to work on with this skill? And I identified them. Who do I need to work on with this skill? And I identified them. I didn't care whether they were in both groups or not, or neither groups. So, it's about designing that data and knowing what you're looking to pull out of it, I think is what allowed me to, again, be more efficient. So the automatic grading was already happening. So that by the time that I got to the data, it was tabulated and it was organized. And then I had a mindset to approach, what am I going to do with this data? So, to give a practical example for what a structure of a classroom could look like. So, let's talk. You want to do a reading skill or a math skill first? What do you think?
I feel like math skill is probably an easier one to uh, visualize. So let's start there.
Okay. All right. So, I'm just going to go with a very standard format for my class. They're going to rotate through 3 different activities. Okay. One is teacher led, 2 of them are independent. So, I'm going to use order of operations. So, prior to this lesson, I had analyzed, do they understand order of operations? And in this case, I generalized it with just strong understanding, clear, almost mastery. They're kind of just where a typical fifth grader should be, or they are definitely below. They don't really understand that different operations tell you to do it in different orders. So when I meet with a group, my first group I'm gonna meet with, I'm just gonna teach them the skill. We're gonna have our whiteboards. We're just gonna crank out the skill. We're gonna do practice problems. I'm gonna highlight multiplication before addition. I'm gonna highlight all of these different pieces. The group that is supposed is kind of where I expect them to be. They're gonna watch a screencast here. I'm leveraging that skill on how to solve problems with order of operations because I've identified that they have a kind of an understanding. I just want to make sure they fully understand it. And then they're going to do some guided problems that are embedded in that screencast where I say, okay, here's a problem. Now go solve it. My group that has pretty much shown mastery, they're going to do practice problems and they're going to use a Google form that requires an exact answer. So they can't move on until they get it right. They're ready for that frustration because they've already shown mastery. As I rotate, and in that first rotation, I might spend like 20 to 25 minutes with that first group. When I rotate, I'm now going to meet with that kind of on grade level group and we're just going to practice. I'm not going to teach them. We're just going to jump right into practice problems. And this is kind of what I was saying, Matt, about that comfort level of that small group instruction. I went in with the mindset knowing I need to teach very slowly to my first group. I need to explain everything. My second group, I'm coming in with the mindset of they should know this. I'm going to practice with them and I'm just going to actively monitor, are they where I think they are? And then I can adjust and I can say, oh, they are not as good as I thought they were. Let me dial it back a notch. Or, yep, they're right where I think they are. Let me keep challenging them. My first group that I worked with, they're going to leave me and they're going to watch a screencast on exactly what I taught them. So now they're going to be retaught the skill by me virtually. My enrichment group, they're going to do something above grade level. In this case, they could take written sentences and build them into number sentences and then solve them. When I rotate to meet with my last group, again, that practice group, it might only be 10 minutes. If they're right where I thought they were, we're just going to practice and they're going to move on from me because I've already solidified that they understand it. If they're below where I thought they were, I'll spend more time with them. I'll give them the time that they need. And so the last rotation, the group I meet with is the enrichment group. I'm going to throw challenges at them. We're going to review those written sentences. I'm going to make sure they understand the skill, and then I'm just going to challenge them like crazy. That on grade level group, they're then going to do that self-checking Google form that can be frustrating because it requires an exact answer. But I've confirmed that they're prepared for it because they were instructed by screencasts, and then I checked in with them. That lower group that needed that instruction, they're going to do another screencast that's just a little bit different. That's going to guide them even more. And so what this hopefully kind of showcases is by using data, by leveraging this skill that I used a lot, that independent ability to watch screencasts, I'm able to leverage different instructional strategies, but provide them what they need. And so a typical format that's very popular is Math Workshop. Math Workshop is a great framework to help you get started with stations. My problem with Math Workshop is it encourages an opening mini lesson and a closing reflection whole group. And what I don't like about that, let me clarify. I love Math Workshop to help teachers get started with student-centered learning. But once you get beyond that, what it encourages you to do is teach the same thing to everybody and then have them rotate through the same activities. And so you're not actually providing them differentiated instruction, and it doesn't allow you to spend more time with some groups and less time with other groups depending on their needs.
Now, do you feel like it's that's the nature of education though? Like, again, that's a realistic way. So whether it's called rotational model or it's just stations,
Mm-hmm.
realistically there is still some value. So just again, if you don't mind clarifying the difference between what you're really striving for, I'm assuming, or what I'm getting from is you are hyper focusing on your super specific drilled down targeted instruction during small group that is not equal, it's fair.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you're saying that this math workshop would be more so equal. Hey, you get the same amount of time, you get the same number of problems. If you get through it, great. If you don't, you only get through 3 problems, it's okay.
Yep. And honestly, they both should be implemented in the classroom. Math Workshop or the typical station rotation, when all of your students are being introduced to something new that there's really not a huge differentiation in ability or prior knowledge, then that makes total sense. You give everyone an introductory mini lesson that can help them get started. And then you meet with one group while another group's maybe doing a game or another group's trying it independently. That makes sense. But there's so many cases in our classroom where we know our students are at extremely different levels. And if we continue that typical station rotation, we're not providing them what they need, because when you meet with that one group, you know you need more time with them, but you can't spend more time with them because the other stations are all designed to be 15 minutes. You feel like you have to rotate every 15 minutes. Whereas for me, it's it's task one that can take 10 to 20 minutes. It doesn't matter, because I'm going to spend the time that I need with the students that I have, and it gives me that freedom of flexibility to adjust as I see how they play it out in front of me.
That makes total sense. I love that idea and that clarification. Thank you.
Yeah. So um, I'm not huge on the Danielson framework. It's not something that I analyze a lot. You actually bring it up a lot more
I
than me,
do.
but I dug into it a little bit and pulled two things out from the framework. So domain 3C, one of the attributes that it identifies is students demonstrate agency and critical thinking in completion of tasks and activities that require high levels of intellectual engagement. And so, some of these strategies, like even that A B partner system, that's going to force them to think critically because they know they're going to have to teach their peers. And 3D, teachers and students are constantly monitoring learning and making use of specific strategies to elicit evidence of understanding. So to me, that's saying you're using data and the students are using their data. And so, if you are putting systems into place where you are using tools that pull data out, even like Kahoot, quizzes, any of those different things, get the students involved in the data process. That's a part of that empowerment. You're empowering them to feel satisfaction that, yes, I'm doing it the way I should, or empowerment and satisfaction of, all right, I'm not where I want to be, but I know I can get the support if I ask for it, or if I just wait for my teacher to pull me into that group that I will need to feel successful.
That makes total sense. And I'll just hesitate to say, if you're not familiar with Danielson, which I think most educators are at this point, teach like a CEO in my grand scheme of things is, the idea of hitting distinguished in Danielson essentially has a classroom functioning without a need of an adult. And what I appreciate, and maybe this is why I bring it up so much, because I hear about this concept so much, and really what you do before you branded it as this is a realistic way to turn so much of that responsibility over, that if you are striving for distinguished, here's your blueprint of what you're prioritizing to make that a reality. So that's part of the reason I bring it up so much. I guess the one other question I want to ask you, Ken, I know we're getting towards the end of this episode, is that the title of this, as the second part of it, really comes down to empowering learning experiences. When I first heard that, I hear you powering your learning opportunities. What would you say by leveraging those opportunities is creating opportunities that are extra special for learners? Because right now I'm hearing a repetitive structure of a classroom. How are you rewarding learners that are really aggressively pursuing and making great strides? Because you just said including learners in their data, including learners so they visually see their growth, including learners that they're doing all of these different features, has a payoff, and they're seeing, like, if they know where they are, yeah, you bet that they're going to be more motivated and able to be held accountable. But how are you also leveraging special experiences in that empowering learning experiences?
That's a fantastic question. And I think it's a key ingredient to that, to keep the motivation up. because the students will, I truly believe you will see an increase in intrinsic motivation because of the way you are empowering them, and frankly just respecting them as a person and showing trust in them. But it also allows you to leverage those special learning experiences. So, you start to rethink, what can I do during these independent learning times? So, let's say you're exploring main idea, okay, which you really could apply to any grade level, or, any social studies science unit. There's a main idea, there's a main concept that you're learning in a unit or in a set of two lessons. So, have the students, maybe if you have iPads available, and there's other programs that you could do something similar to this, but instead of them reading something and identifying the main idea, have them create an iMovie trailer around. You give them different topics that they could choose, and they have to develop something that showcases the main idea throughout. And so you start to create opportunities for that. And I would challenge you to not only think of activities like that as something that you get when you are in the enrichment group, because our remediation groups, those lower level groups, they actually need that more than the enrichment groups at times. And so instead of kids that constantly struggle to read and constantly struggle to identify these skills through reading, give them a different lens to learn and explore that concept through. And so then when I meet with a group that was supposed to, whether it's partners, individuals, supposed to create an iMovie trailer with some sort of main idea or theme, or it showcased a vocabulary word or a set of vocabulary words that are connected. There's so many ways you can reframe that if you just think outside the box a little bit. When we meet as a small group, we're going to watch it and we're going to identify the main idea, or we're going to identify the three vocab words that was highlighted in that. And so that comes from you trusting students to work independently, and students believing in themselves that they can successfully do that. I'm not going to roll that out on September 15th, but at some point I'm going to introduce iMovie trailer, or Powtoons, or any of these different creative programs that you want to use with your students. I'm going to roll that out in some sort of whole group lesson where they all are exposed and they learn it. And so then I can re-leverage that whenever I want in some sort of small group independent activity that I can embed into that instruction. And so, yeah, it's easy to do with the enrichment kids. But there's different ways to do it. You can have enrichment kids make a screencast to show another student. You can have them meet together and actually tutor each other. Like you start to look at, how can I leverage the students with each other and for each other to just fuel that empowering experience. And again, it's all about, how do I get more time, more undistracted, focused time with the students that are going to sit in front of me that need me most, whether it's to enrich them, to teach them on grade level, or to bring them up to grade level. Does that answer your question?
It does. And I think, just to second that, when you create the more time and it's undistracted, we go and we teach for an hour. And when we think about, if we were to teach that lesson uninterrupted, it's probably about, I don't know, 8 to 12 minutes worth of content. Now, part of that is delivery and distractions, and part of it is processing time and wait time and work time. But very easily, there's a way that you can leverage an hour worth of classroom traditional stand and deliver instruction and turn it into as efficient, if not more efficient, 35-minute lesson or less.
Yeah. And what I'll say too is, you know, again, I was not 1-to-1, which is not a huge deal. But everything I did wasn't like this elaborate, crazy, cool stuff. Like, my kids read articles, read books, filled out worksheets. Like, they did do that as part of their independent work. But when you come up with different strategies, and again, you explicitly teach and set expectations for what this independent learning looks like, you're empowering them to do it successfully. And so you have to have systems in place to check their work, to collect certain things, to grade certain things, to keep those expectations at a high level. But when you start to fuel and start to put all of these pieces together and you build momentum from September through May, and you build momentum from year 2 to year 5, as all of this snowballs, you truly can get to a point where you can just focus on meeting with kids. And that is where great instruction happens, and that's where you can identify what they truly need, and you can really push them to new levels, and you can push them to accomplish great things with you and without you. And that's what the whole empowering experiences is about for me.
I don't think there's a better way to wrap up the episode than that point, because that's, the empowerment. Walking into this conversation, I viewed it differently, but I see how you leveraged what you had available. And, whenever you're listening to this, you may have different tools and you might have different workarounds. The emphasis that I would hopefully echo is, you don't have to do it all the time, and you can start small, and, you don't have to wait to the beginning of next year to say, hey, this is going to be my year-long initiative. If you want to start this in December, if you want to start it in March, May even, give it a shot and see how it is, and let the feedback from the kids prove to you whether or not it was worthwhile, with an open mind that you need to make adjustments. And maybe those adjustments are workability, like you're not editing videos, you're uploading a one-take video and being happy with that. Or, maybe you don't necessarily do Ed Puzzle this year, but you take your videos from last year, you insert them. Because I think you heard a lot, Ken, of you talking about safeguards to catch kids from A, taking the shortcut, or B, I love how you had an I don't know as part of some of the questions, because I don't care to know if a kid guessed correctly, if it's a guess. And I think that is a brilliant thing that the kids can be honest about, that can allow you to target them, as opposed to you blissfully teaching, assuming that they know more than the lucky guess, and maybe deductive reasoning, or, their context clues allowed them to understand.
Right. And the reality is, it's not perfect. I had kids that skipped out on work, didn't try on work all the time. Like, all of those normal realities we face as a classroom teacher still happen, but it's in an experience where you're able to target kids more, and more so than not, they are engaging in it a little bit fuller. And that idea of I don't know, I just think it's such a valuable skill for someone to say I don't know, because it's something we even struggle with as adults. And honestly, I think I had kids that got them right and still chose I don't know on purpose, because they just wanted to be in the group that got extra practice on the skill. And I'm totally fine with that. If that's a decision they were making, I'm totally fine with that. So I agree. We can wrap this one down here. Teach Like a CEO Part 2. We're going to talk about Part 3 next week, which is focusing on the operations of a classroom. A lot of it you'll probably think that you do, but it's just a good reframing and refocus for that. So if you have not already, please subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen or watch on YouTube. Everything that we talked about tonight, I'm going to take some screenshots, pull some resources. I'll even find some of my worst screencasts, so you can see how even bad screencasts are still highly effective for students to learn from. And I'll drop that all into our show notes page, which can be found at powereduup.com/show78. So I hope you're enjoying summer, if you're listening to this during the summer of our PD series. And Matt, why don't you take us on out of here?
All right. As we powered down this episode, hopefully you're feeling powered up like a CEO. Looking forward to next week's conversation. But in the meantime, have a great week, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to or watching us on YouTube. Each week, we get to talk to amazing educators who are making a positive impact on the lives of students, their colleagues, administrators, and education as a whole. It's been such a privilege every week to be able to talk to these incredible individuals, learn from them, grow with them, and better myself and all of education through these conversations. If you haven't already, please consider sharing this with a colleague, someone who can benefit and be powered up from the experience of listening to these incredible conversations. Because of Powered Up, we are powering education by empowering you.